All right. I think we're live. All right, I'm using my phone to check to see if we're live. Comment if you can hear me. There we go. Perfect. Good morning. Aloha mai kako from Hawaii ne. Let's see, we have Ian. And Leah seems to be here. Okay. So I'm live streaming today from my home. Just so you know, if you hear any natural sounds, I have a stream right out back. You may hear some birds, beautiful sounds of Hawaii. I'm also going to be looking down at my phone as I'm presenting. Well, maybe not while I'm presenting, but this is how I'm going to see the comments. So Leah and Anna will address any issues that come up or any questions you have, because I won't be looking down all the time. Looks like we have 5 people so far. It's just about 9 o'clock. So I'm going to wait a few minutes to see if other people can join us. But in the meantime, I suppose I'll introduce myself. My name is Danny Yarbrough. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and I'm in the 3rd year of my PhD program already. Time really flies. I focus on language revitalization, actually, so today's topic is near and dear to my heart. I look primarily at how linguistic information can be used to inform pedagogical material development and curriculum design. So I'm very excited to give this workshop to you today, kind of share some of the things I'm passionate about in linguistics. As far as communities go, I tend to work primarily with the Amskapi Pikani, or the Blackfeet Nation, located in what's now northwestern Montana. And it's a band, the southernmost band of the Niitsitapi Peaks, which extends up until the province of Alberta. I also get to work with a little bit of Olelo Hawaii, which is very exciting considering I'm here in Hawaii. Good morning, Circle of Indigenous People. I see you've joined us. Sorry also about the time zone difference. We forget sometimes here in Hawaii we don't have daylight savings time. So I apologize for any of you who joined us early. It was still 8 o'clock here in Hawaii. Okay. Looks like there's 10 people with us, so just after 9, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So for those who just joined us, my name is Danny Yarbrough, PhD student here at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and today we're going to be talking about language revitalization and funding. So we'll talk about types of language revitalization, common problems that revitalization efforts face, and then at the end we'll give you a few resources that talk about funding opportunities. I do want to start out with a disclaimer that language revitalization is a huge topic. We could probably do a whole webinar series just on revitalization. So today we'll go over more general ideas of revitalization, what it is, and some things we've seen in the world as far as efforts, but we are not going to cover nearly the amount of work that's already being done. So feel free to comment in the Facebook group, and we're going to start discussions. We can inspire each other and talk about the different projects we're all aware of. All right. So to begin, let's start off with a definition of what language revitalization is. This can vary depending on who you're asking, but a good general definition is the attempt by interested parties, including individuals, cultural or community groups, governments, or political authorities, to reverse the decline of a language. So it's a very broad definition, and it's going to vary, again, based on who you ask, as well as the terminology. We're going to use language revitalization in this workshop because it seems to be the most widely used term, but it can also be called language revival, reclamation, reversing language shift, awakening, and other terms. And some facts that we want to go over is language loss can happen rather quickly, and the loss happens a lot faster than the revitalization. It can actually be lost in as little as 3 generations. So you have the first generation who chooses to stop speaking the language to their children. For whatever motivation or reason, there are a variety of reasons that motivate people not to pass on their language. The second generation then only has a passive knowledge of the language. They've heard it, they may be able to produce some of the language, but they're not native speakers anymore. And by the time they have children, the third generation, that generation has little to no knowledge because they're only able to hear maybe their grandparents use it in particular contexts. So it can disappear that quickly, but revitalization efforts take many, many years to recover. And as I mentioned before, briefly, there are many external factors that play into revitalization, and this is going to vary based on the community and the history that is around that community and that leads to language endangerment and loss. It's very complicated and very customized, so you're going to have to learn more about your community, the communities you work with, to determine those factors. But it is important to recognize them because they tend to have lasting impacts on revitalization efforts. Another thing that we want to talk about is language change. We often refer to languages as living. And the reason we do this is because they're constantly in a state of change. They're used for communicative purposes, and so they change. The younger kids want to change the way they speak to identify with their peer group, and the same thing is true of language revitalization. When they become endangered and then revitalized, they tend to shift or change. And that is a natural part of language and a natural part of revitalization. So don't be discouraged if changes happen during the revitalization process. Also, the more endangered a language is, the harder it is going to be to revitalize it. And that's just because you have less speakers, you're in a more time-pressing situation. It's not impossible by any means, and we'll cover some examples of that later, but it is going to be more difficult. So if you're able to start revitalization efforts sooner rather than later, we definitely encourage that. Is a good idea. Okay, so some general goals for revitalization. These can be very specific to community and very broad. As far as major goals, I think the most obvious one is to increase the number of speakers of the language. So we want to raise those speaker numbers up and get the younger generation using the language in their life. And you want to see language use occur between generations, so the grandparents, the children, and the adults in between, and then across different groups. So the children using it with themselves, adults using it with themselves, having everybody chime in to the revitalization effort. Also, an essential part of revitalization is establishing domains of use for the language. So these are places that the language is used, whether it be the bank, going to the grocery store, using it in the classroom, in the home, at social gatherings, having these different places and spaces where you can use the language to actually live in the language versus just studying the language. So establishing domains of use is a very difficult task, but an essential one to revitalization. Okay, so problems. Now, problems are going to come up when you do language revitalization. There are a multitude of situations, again, that cause endangerment to arise, and those tend to persist when you revitalize as well. The most common problem is obviously speakers. As your speaking population gets older, you have less and less speakers to work with, and that's the essential problem for language revitalization. The other things that factor in are actually external to the language itself and sometimes external to the community. Things like government policies. Is there overt oppression of the language or no support for the language? Equality in use and opportunities to use it in things like the legal system, out and about in transactions that you would expect to be able to use the dominant language. Those are all government policies. So things external to the community. There are also socioeconomic factors that go into revitalization efforts and endangerment in the first place. Things like perceiving your children may have a disadvantage economically if they were to speak the language. That is a motivation for endangerment, and also a motivation not to revitalize the language, to let the language go, if that perceived discrimination is there. Same thing with social discrimination, stigmatization, and discrimination. Domains of use, as we talked about, is essential, but it's also one of the problems. Getting those set up and having spaces where you can use the language is going to be difficult. If you can't practice the language in your daily life, it becomes much more difficult to use it and gain fluency. And sometimes there is interest and involvement issues. Communities may be choosing to not use their language for one of the aforementioned reasons, like socioeconomic pressures. And that may lead to a lack of interest in revitalization, or there may be too much trauma associated with the language to want to really motivate or stops motivation in revitalization efforts. Also, children want to identify with their peer group. They may not be interested in speaking the language because of globalization. They want to speak a more dominant language, and they stop using the language amongst themselves. So those are some common motivations or motivational issues that happen with revitalization. There's also more logistic things like pedagogical materials. If you're trying to create a curriculum or teach the language, then having materials is an essential part of that. If you actually go online and Google your language or the community's language that you work with, you will find that you do not have nearly the amount of resources available if you Google, say, English or Spanish. There are lots of online materials, a plethora of textbooks, curriculums, pedagogy. All these things have been created and customized for many global languages. So this is not something that many indigenous communities have available to them. An issue that feeds into that is funding. To create materials, to create the research that it takes to design materials and curriculum, those need to be funded. And if your language is underdocumented, then funding is also an essential part of doing the documentation work to begin the revitalization work. And so funding can be a challenge. Historically, it's been much more of a challenge than it is now. It is getting better, and we'll talk about funding at the end of the workshop. But it is something that you will probably face at one point or another during the revitalization efforts. And of course, the biggest issue is time. When you have limited speakers left and they're leaving the community, you have also the challenge of raising new speakers. These are both factors that time greatly impacts, right? Having the ability to keep them both at the same time, document, create materials, and teach the language. So time is definitely a factor and a challenge in revitalization. Now, while this list is quite long, let's say that there are no problems that are insurmountable, right? These are issues that will come up, and it's good to be aware of these issues, but all of them can be addressed in revitalization efforts. All right, so how can we revitalize a language? We're going to go through a couple of options here, but I'd love to see some comments from all of you on any steps you may have taken in a revitalization program for your own communities or communities that you work with. So feel free to leave some comments. We'll get discussions going on different types of revitalization efforts that are out there. We'll talk about the main iconic ones in the field of revitalization, but let's inspire each other and talk to each other about what we have been doing in the field and what communities have been doing, and bounce ideas back and forth off of each other. Right. So there are two different scales, if you will. This is kind of an oversimplification, but for our purposes, it will work well. There's a large scale revitalization movement, and these tend to be very broad, either countrywide, if you're at the largest level, or community-wide. So something a little bit smaller, but still a larger group effort. And these are things that are we've seen, like Hebrew is an example of a countrywide shift. You also have Scottish and Irish Gaelic, and Olelo Hawaii, Maori. There are many examples of community-wide or nationwide support. These are beneficial because you have the support, or you can have the support of the federal or local government system. So that does aid in revitalization efforts, but that is not an option for every language community. So we also have small-scale language revitalization efforts. And this can be as small as one individual who takes it upon themselves to revitalize the language and learn the language themselves, or it can be a small group, so an entity within the community that chooses to continue on with the language. And this can be family use in the home, or you can look at community programs, centers, workshops, or any kind of particular school that takes on and teaches language as well. So going over these types of large and small language revitalization efforts, we're going to talk first about language nests. And language nests refer to preschool or kindergarten settings, and this is where child care is given from adult speakers, either native speakers or second language heritage learners. And they teach and raise the children in the language in this home or in this child care setting. So some of our more successful ones that people tend to point to are the Te Kohanga over in Aotearoa. Aotearoa is the name for New Zealand in Maori. And then you also have Punana here in Hawaii. So we'll look at the history of these two different organizations briefly. So the Te Kohanga over in Aotearoa was first established in 1982. And currently, there are 460 of these language nests throughout Aotearoa. So that's a great growth in language nests. And they have about 9,000 children currently enrolled. That represents a total of 5% of all the children in early childhood education. So that is a great movement, great numbers, and very inspiring. It was a community-based movement as well. So this was not supported or initiative from the local government, but rather community members who were interested in seeing Maori continue to be used. They actually inspired Punana Leo here in Hawaii. And it was established 2 years after. In 1984 was the first nest over in Kauai. And currently they have 11 preschools, and those are located on 5 main islands of the Hawaiian chain. And an interesting fact about the Hawaiian schools here, the language nests here, Punana Leo, is that they were started before the law was lifted that said that Hawaiian was not allowed to be used as the medium of education in any circumstance. So from 1896 to 1986, it was not allowed to use Hawaiian as a medium of instruction, but Punana Leo did it anyway. So definitely recognizing those governmental issues and laws and legislation is something that you need to combat, but there are times where people have gone beyond that or gone around that to start revitalization efforts. Another famous type of language revitalization is an immersion school. And immersion schools are the post-kindergarten level. So this would be an actual school setting. It can be anywhere from kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade. And they focus mainly on teaching some to all of the academic subjects in the native language, depending on the ability of the teachers to speak the language. And so another example that we're going to look at here from Hawaii is Ke Kula Kaiapuni o Anuenue, or Anuenue for short. And Anuenue is located here. It is a K through 12 school on Oahu, and it's located at the back of Pololo Valley. They do teach Hawaiian and Olelo Hawaii as the primary means of using it for a subject of study as well as all academic studies, and they don't actually introduce language until later on in the program. I believe it's around the 5th grade. They focus not only on academic subjects, but also on traditional knowledge. So cultural practices are introduced as part of the curriculum. So this leans more towards the term reclamation than revitalization, but it's an example of an immersion school, and there are a couple of them through Hawaii. Just take Anuenue because it's down the road from me. Okay. Now, the previous two ones, the language nests and immersion schools, those tend to be focused on the children, but there are programs that are looking at the adult population, the ones that bridge the gap from the elder native speakers to the children. And one example of this is the Master Apprentice program. And this is a program where all the participants are adults. You have the apprentice, who's the advanced heritage speaker, and they tend to be paired with a master or a mentor who is a native speaking elder. And they meet regularly to converse and discuss the language and kind of learn through doing things in the language. And this can be just meeting every once in a while, or as establishes them moving in and actually doing full immersion with an adult. So you can see some varieties of master apprentice programs as they've kind of developed over the years. One example that we're going to mention is the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program. And this was founded in 2007. It was based off of smaller community initiatives. And they selected 20 individuals to produce basically 10 additional fluent speakers in a time frame of 18 to 24 months. So this is a very intensive program and aimed at getting adult, proficient or fluent adult language speakers. I feel like it's important to recognize the adult community there. We tend to focus on children and elders in revitalization efforts, but the adults are the ones who teach and do a lot of the bridging between the two communities. So it's a good thing to mention programs like this that do also focus on teacher training, adult language learners, not just children, although children are very important in language revitalization. Okay, so a couple of other community-based initiatives. It doesn't have to be something as large scale as a language nest or an immersion program or a master apprentice program. You can have something as small as an individual who's looking at doing revitalization efforts, learning a community language at any age, and establishes some sort of program or summer camp, weekend activities. They can be smaller scale. And also raising awareness of your endangerment or the endangerment status of your language and language activism, those also count towards the language revitalization movement. Sometimes you need to address those issues before or during revitalization efforts. And we'll look at a couple examples here. This is a video, we're not going to play it right now, but I do encourage you to go watch it. This is Dr. William O'Grady. He's a professor here at University of Hawaii Manoa, and he works with Sejong Yang, and they look at Jejuo, which is a language spoken on the island of Jeju, off the coast of Korea. And they actually had to get Jejuo recognized as an independent language of Korean, not just a dialect. So he also has a lot of great information and advice for language revitalization. So I highly suggest watching the interview. It's about an hour in length. Excuse me. But it's a good example of other things that you may have to, problems or concerns you have to address while also looking at revitalizing the language itself. Another great example is the Miamia language, or Miami, and it was considered an extinct language by many. If you use the term extinct, you can also call it a dormant language. And this is a community that had no native speakers. They started out with 0 native speakers. But Darrell Baldwin took it upon himself to teach himself the language from historic documents and studies at the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. And he learned his own language and then reintroduced it to his home. So he started raising his children with the Miamia language. And the efforts have grown over the years, and they are looking at teacher training programs, and there's a revitalization movement happening more community-wide. So this is a great example of just one individual taking the initiative and it growing into something larger. Okay. So go ahead and comment also in the Facebook group things that you're currently doing. Again, inspire each other, bounce ideas off of one another. It's very important to keep in mind that every community does vary, and what works for one community may not work for yours. So sharing ideas back and forth is a great way to maximize the resources and time that everybody's putting into revitalization efforts. And we encourage you to do that on the Facebook group, contact other communities, and talk about what you are doing in your own community to do language revitalization efforts. But we have a couple of tips based on what we've seen from successful revitalization programs that may help you in setting up or starting revitalization efforts. The main thing is that it is a long-term project. Revitalization does take longer to reverse than language loss. And this is a long-term community commitment, and it is hard work. It is definitely worth it, absolutely worth it, and there are moments there it's absolutely inspiring, but it can be trying as well. So having an enthusiasm for language revitalization is going to be essential in carrying you through those more difficult times. A well thought out plan is also good. If you take a moment to think about what situations is the community facing, is going to be important, because a lot of those are external factors, and then you have the linguistic factors. Do you need to document? Do you have materials? Do you need to set up a school? So going in with a game plan and breaking that game plan down into small achievable steps is going to alleviate a lot of stress in a revitalization situation and be a more effective use of your time. Again, time is essential. Reaching out to speakers is another thing. If you yourself are a speaker, you can mentor somebody who is not. If you're not a speaker, you can find someone to mentor you. And speakers, as you saw with language nests, they are the ones who can raise the kids in the language. You have second language speakers who do a lot of teaching, who do instructions in the school settings. So it's important to find out who speaks the language and get people mentoring others. Language immersion is also one of the more iconic ways of doing language revitalization. It does require more funds and a lot of work to set up an immersion program, but it does tend to be very successful if you can manage to establish a language immersion setting, whether it be a nest or a school. Something to definitely try and look into. And one of probably the most essential ones, and one of the more difficult, is commitment to set up domains of use outside of the school and the home. Immersion schools are a great way to do language revitalization, and home is an essential part of using the language and making it a daily means of communication. But being able to go elsewhere and interact with other speakers and have safe settings where you can use the language is a great place to begin. So you can set up a community center or have designated activities or workshops, as I mentioned before, but getting the language out into these different domains is important. So another very essential part to revitalization. And don't be afraid to start small. So creating domains, I focus mostly outside the home, but if you're beginning revitalization, you can set up domains inside your home. So designate an area of your house that is only for the indigenous language. You can look at the kitchen, for example. When we're here, we speak in the language. Elsewhere in the house, we can use whatever dominant language is around, but here we focus on using the indigenous language, and then you can grow out from there in your home. So if you're starting in the house, don't be afraid to start small and designate just a small area where language is the focus. We covered that. Find a mentor or a speaker to learn your language or become a mentor if you do speak your language, and you can start with just a few hours a week. Excuse me. It does not need to be all day, every day in the language. If you can, that's great. But not everybody has that sort of availability. Some people have to work, and you have normal lives. You have to raise your children, and you don't always have time to do complete, full immersion. So if you can only start off with a few hours a day, start there. Also, again, those community groups are really important. Gathering, speaking the language, doing activities, whether it's traditional crafts or going out and learning the traditional ecological knowledge, practicing skills, any area that will allow you to use language for a particular period of time around a certain subject is a great place to start. And if you're having problems, as I mentioned, with motivation or interest in revitalization, a good idea to inspire revitalization movements is to do a presentation to your community or the community you work with about some of the more interesting aspects of the language. Why is it worth revitalizing? What is so cool about our language that we want to make sure that it's passed on to the next generation? Sometimes highlighting how unique a language is, because all languages are unique. Highlighting the unique parts and what is really special about your language and what you want to continue on, that can be enough to spark motivation. So if you're facing that particular problem, maybe try putting together a presentation and giving it to the community. Okay, so funding. Funding is a issue that we've talked about, and I don't really know much funding outside of the continental US, or actually the United States of America in general. That's kind of my area of focus. That's what I'm most familiar with. But we did pull together a list of resources that are international as well as country specific. So let's talk a little bit about these. One of the ones I want to point out is one of the more well-known ones, which is the Endangered Languages Documentation Program. And we have the URL there for you so you can see their site. They fund projects from any nationality. So it's not a particular country, but anybody is eligible to apply. The grants are due January 15th, so we've missed the deadline for this year, 2019, but you can prepare for 2020. And the more endangered and the less documented your language tends to be, the more likely it is that ELDP will fund you, but don't be discouraged. It's always worth putting in the application. And they have a variety of applications and grants that you can apply for depending on the project that you're looking at. So they have small grants, which are as little as £10,000. Still quite a bit of money, I shouldn't say little as £10,000, but about the £10,000 mark. And these are for smaller projects. And then you can do individual, either graduate or postdoctoral grants. So these are PhD students either currently documenting a language or post-grad who are doing a documentation project. And then there's major documentation projects as well. And these tend to be for projects that are larger in scale and tend to have multiple researchers. So if you're looking at an interdisciplinary research project, this is the type of grant you'd want to apply for. And a few other funding sources that we want to mention is the Foundation for Endangered Languages. This is a UK-based institution, but they do fund worldwide projects, so you don't have to be from the UK to apply. Their deadline is at the end of the year, so there's still an opportunity for 2019. And there's a website where you can read more into the requirements for the grants and look at the application process. And the last one is not necessarily an agency that funds, but rather a resource network. It's based in Australia. It's a resource network for linguistic diversity. And they have some very useful information, so definitely look at their site and read through it. But they also have these excellent lists of funding sources. So the first one we've linked here for you is a list of international funding sources. So again, people that fund regardless of where you're at in the world. They also have a separate list that are funding agencies in a country that only fund projects from that country. So if you're in one of those countries listed there, you can look for local sources of funding that way. All right, so that is the end of the presentation. I think we'll go ahead and look at questions and comments. I'll take a moment here to review what's been said. Feel free to ask any questions you may have. Okay, I'm glad you guys can hear me. So Guillaume has posted some very good information, 3 successful cases in Europe. Yeah, these are, thank you for updating us. So we have Basque, Catalan, and Welsh, also great programs. Okay, so there are so many to cover. I'm really glad to see all of us contributing to the comments. Circle of Indigenous People, it's a not-for-profit institution. That's definitely another way to go about language revitalization. I know Punana Leo is started out as nonprofit. The entity I work with, the Pagan Institute on the Blackfeet Nation, is also a 501c3 nonprofit. So that's a great avenue to look in as well. Okay. I'll just hang out here for a few minutes, see if you have any questions. Feel free to ask me. And also feel free to post in the Facebook group over the next several days if you have any questions or interest in finding out more about revitalization efforts. We're all very happy to talk to you about it. So Anna asked a question, what do you think about crowdfunding for language revitalization? I think crowdfunding is a great option. I think there's no bad options when it comes to revitalization. Finding ways that you can get funded, finding ways that you can get collaboration with different entities or even other communities, those are all excellent options for revitalization. Do anything and everything you can to help revitalization efforts is my opinion. Crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, turning over to the online communities, building a network here, not only in the ELDP, LDTC website, but there are so many resources online where communities are able to reach out to each other and discuss language revitalization work. So I'm all for it. Okay, so we have a question. What do you say about communities having a negative view on another language, usually the more dominant language, which more and more members are choosing? Is this healthy or normal? I would say it's definitely normal. It's not unusual to find different opinions on languages. There's a lot of power dynamics. There are a lot of socio issues that go into that. I believe there's more strength in us supporting each other. That's just my personal opinion, and so I tend not to take a negative view on any language, but that is something you will encounter. And yeah, so it's something I think is normal. I wouldn't necessarily say it's healthy in my personal opinion, but it's definitely normal, and in fact, it's usually the reason why many languages are endangered, right? They're seen as inferior in some way, and those power dynamics have been established and create the endangerment situation. Okay. All right, so what about revitalization when the dominant language speakers or community is opposed to it? It is controversial. It is very difficult. There's not one answer, I feel like, either. That thing with revitalization is what works in one region of the world may not work in another. And I think there are very real factors in some communities that it actually could be dangerous to do revitalization if there's active discrimination or stigmatization of a group. We definitely don't want to encourage anybody to put themselves in a dangerous situation. And so you'd have to judge based on your own communities what the political climate is around your language and if that's an option for you. And then negative attitudes is just something you're going to have to deal with from time to time, I think, in any kind of minority community dealing with a majority. Again, those power dynamics are very real and echo through communities in multiple different ways. So yeah, it's an issue and something that I think is highly customized to each circumstance. So I don't have a general answer for that, but I think having the conversation in general is a good way to start talking and breaking down those stereotypes and those ideologies that one language is somehow superior to another. What roles can or should an outsider, often white, linguist such as have in such community projects that often take place in minoritized communities, especially with today's decolonization efforts, when traditional white linguists have built a career on others' cultural heritage? This is an excellent question. I do see this talked about more and more, which is great to see that we're becoming more aware of the impacts that outsiders have on Indigenous communities. I think, talking from my own personal opinion, most of this is very opinionated when you come to the topic of revitalization. But in my opinion, I think it is important to be aware of those histories and those circumstances that led to the revitalization, endangerment, or language endangerment and need for revitalization, because that does talk a lot about people coming in from the outside and how that's perceived by a community. So even though it's not directly linguistic, I encourage you to, if you're an outsider, to learn about the community, learn about the histories, and really be self-aware. Excuse me, if you're asking questions like this, you are thinking about it, which is a good step. But I would recommend, yeah, definitely researching the area, and maybe don't jump right into helping the language, but maybe getting to know the community and establishing relationships, because ultimately we're people, and working with people requires a relationship. So hanging around, getting to know the people, seeing if they're receptive to you being there, and just being aware of what impact you have on the community are all good ways to look at community projects. If you're invited in, obviously the best situation where they ask you to collaborate. But when you're doing research, make sure, as if you are an academic, that what you do as a research has some benefit for the community beyond just linguistic knowledge, right? Make something that is going to help them in their goals, something that they're interested in. And you can find this out by simply asking, right? I think that's a great place to start, is being upfront, saying, I know I'm from outside the community, I am an academic, so I'm looking at linguistic research. what do you need from me? How can I help, and how can I contribute? Just asking the question is also a great place to start. What potential problems might we face with new speakers of language revitalization? I don't think there's much problems as things that you'll see as far as language change, motivation as well. Learning a language is hard. Not everybody is a good language learner, and there are multiple ways to contribute to language revitalization efforts. So I think motivation, keeping in mind that if a child or an adult participant is having difficulties learning the language, don't be discouraged by that and encourage them to be involved in multiple different ways. And language change. Be patient with language change, transfer in particular. Non-native speakers, we all know if you learn a second language, you have some transfer from your native language. And so being aware of those, a lot of that is a process of learning and having that transfer. So those are the two I tend to see or hear talked about most often is the motivation and the language change and shift. Being open with those and understanding those is going to be, I think, probably the biggest problems, but also things that are very easily dealt with. Yes, Circle of Indigenous Peoples, we would love to see the results from the event that you're having. Let's see, first Gathering Circle in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, Bridging Nations and Cultures on March 23rd. Please share that with us. We'd love to see it. So Guillaume's brought up the legitimacy, the issue of who is a real speaker. There is definitely a lot of information out there and a lot of conversation happening around who is a speaker, who is not. The linguistic identities, it's not something I can speak to, not being a community member myself and not having experienced that firsthand. I don't think it's an appropriate topic for me to discuss, but definitely an interesting topic. And if you are a community member in revitalization efforts, it's great if you can discuss that, getting more information about that out there, what it's like to be a member of the community going through revitalization, I think will help many other communities and other speakers going through similar situations. We got some great discussion here. Good references. References for revitalization work in general, or what type of references would you like to see? I know we could, Anna, Leah, and I can probably post a couple different, if you're interested, like academic articles, if that's what you mean. We can definitely post some revitalization related resources in the Facebook group. I think that was Siam's question. Wait a few more minutes, see if there's any other questions. I missed any. Great. Yeah, we'll definitely add some resources for all of you. And feel free to add any that you're aware of too. So you can have a little mini resource list in the Facebook group. Well, I'll hang out for just a few more minutes, but thank you all so much for joining us, not just for this workshop, but for all of the ones before it. It's been really great to see all the comments and discussion that's been happening. So I've really enjoyed this collaboration between the Language Documentation Training Center and the Endangered Languages Project. So I hope you've all enjoyed this as well, and I'd love to keep talking to all of you over the upcoming weeks, months, and years as we continue with language documentation and revitalization. Welcome, it was great. Thank you for joining us. Great. I think at this point, it looks like we've answered all the questions, but again, if anything comes to mind, feel free to post it on the Facebook group. So I think right now I'll say ahui ho, everybody from Hawaii, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're joining from. Have a good night or day.